All right, hey there, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for tonight's webinar. My name is Andrew King. I'm the editor-in-chief of Canadian Musician Magazine, and hosting this webinar brought to you by NWC Webinars. In a moment, I'll introduce our presenter, Adam Gallant from the Hill Sound Studio in Charlottetown. Tonight, we're talking about basic mic techniques. So we're going to start with a bit of an overview of the different types of microphones typically used in recording, talk about some of the different characteristics, their ideal uses, and then we'll get into some basic kind of industry standard staple microphone techniques for everything from vocals to acoustic and electric guitar, bass, drums, etc. We invite your questions or comments throughout the whole thing. So you know, we're going to stop about halfway through the session for a short question period. We'll take anything that's, I guess, timely or relevant to anything that Adam or I have discussed. If we don't get to your question, then fret not, because at the end of the session, we'll have a slightly longer Q&A period. You can submit your questions via the little text window in your interface. And as far as that interface, I'm just going to launch a quick poll here. Those of us that have joined us in the past know we're just trying to gauge who's joining us for the session, both to, I guess, cater our discussion this evening, but also just to help inform the topics we choose for future sessions. So would love to hear how you're at all involved in the music or audio industry. I'll keep this open for a second. A few other housekeeping tips. In the handouts section, you can download what's a PDF of the slideshow that's going to comprise the majority of the presentation this evening. There's some note-taking space on the right, so you do have time if you want to print that off and jot some things down. I will say we typically keep our slideshows pretty bare and rely very much on the conversation as the majority of the information for the webinar. This evening, though, we do have more slides than usual. There's a bit more information packed into them, so please do download that PDF. Even if you're not going to take notes, just being able to reference it later will likely be very helpful. And I'll wrap up the poll in a second here. We've got about 3/4 of attendees that have responded. A few other housekeeping things. Yeah, at the end of the session, once we've logged off here, you'll be asked to fill out a very, very short survey, basically just assessing what you thought of the content, of the overall presentation, of the technical interface for tonight's session. And again, that just helps us steer what we do in the future. Any comments on topics you'd like to see us tackle down the road, of course, are more than welcome. There's also going to be a link to a site from our sister company, musicbooksplus.com, where you can check out some book titles related to our topic tonight if you want to do some further reading. There's also some tips there for making the most of your webinar next time, and a discount code to take advantage of from musicbooksplus.com. So stick with that. Got the majority of our attendees, so I'll close the poll here in 30 seconds. If you haven't voted, please do. I guess it's not a vote, but here we go. And yeah, I'll share these results with you. So yeah, about 1/3 of our participants are performing or recording artists, which is great. People, I guess, wanting just some basic tips to get some really clean, good tracks on their own. Some songwriters joining us as well. Wow, that's probably the highest in the other category, so we'll assume it's some budding studio professionals. Anyway, welcome to everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. Why don't we get started here? There we go. So yeah, you're joining us for home recording basic mic techniques. My name is Andrew King, editor-in-chief of Canadian Musician Magazine, as well as our sister publications. But yeah, joining me this evening, Adam Gallant from the Hill Sound Studio in Charlottetown, PEI. He's worked with a number of very popular artists from here in Atlantic Canada, as well as the CBC, the National Film Board. Just passing through a great PEI-based web series. If you haven't heard of it and you're into, I guess, kind of grisly comedy a la Trailer Park Boys, do check it out. And yeah, he's got a great studio downtown Charlottetown. If you're not from PEI but maybe looking for somewhere to do some recording, a bit of a getaway, I can't think of a better place than the island. Full disclosure, I live there myself, but thrilled to have Adam joining us this evening. I'll hand it over to him in a moment. Just to tell you, this evening we're going to be taking you through a few things. We're going to talk about the different types of microphones used in recording and some of their ideal applications. Adam will have some ideas on, if you're getting started with basic home recording, a few mics that you might want to do this kind of work proficiently. We'll share some basic techniques for everything from voice to electric and acoustic guitars, drums, and more, and then some tips on how to assess whether what you're picking up is quality stuff. So yeah, why don't we get right into it here. Adam, we're thrilled to have you join us. We're going to go through each of the different polar or pickup patterns typically available on microphones. Just a quick walkthrough here. The name says a lot, but the main ones here are omnidirectional. Next is cardioid, supercardioid, or hypercardioid, which all kind of follow the basic cardioid shape. And then there's the figure 8 or bidirectional microphones. We're going to take you through what each of those means. Yeah, Adam, pleasure having you here. And why don't we get started here? The cardioid microphone, arguably the most ubiquitous in the industry. Of course, the Shure SM58, maybe the most iconic example of that. Yeah, tell us a bit about the properties of these types of microphones and their, I guess, most common studio uses, if you please.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me. It's great to share a bit of experience with people. In terms of this microphone type, the cardioid, it's called a cardioid because it's kind of like a heart, and the benefit being that at the back of the microphone, there's not a lot of sound that will enter into the capsule. Therefore, if you're behind the microphone, it's quite quiet, and if you're in front of the microphone, it's doing its job. It's picking up all of the sound that's hitting the capsule. Yeah, I'm sure a lot of you out there, if you're a singer-songwriter and you've played at a venue and you're singing into a little gray mic, it's probably going to be the Shure SM58, and that's a prime example of the most classic cardioid microphone out there. It's good because it prevents feedback. So you've got your monitor wedge on the stage, and that sound is coming out of the wedge and hitting the back of the microphone, and because of the nature of this pickup pattern, you're not going to get as much feedback as you would, say, an Omni pickup pattern. And you'll see the most ubiquitous kind of cardioid microphone in studios would be the Shure SM57. That's generally an instrument mic, but it has the same cardioid pickup pattern, and it's great for if you've got like a guitar amp in the same room as your drums, and you want to isolate as much as you can on that guitar amp.
Bingo. And like, we mentioned here, it's good for close miking drums. Is that like across the whole kit, or yeah, if you were going to use some cardioid mics for your kit, where would it typically be placed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, this is the SM7 on a snare, on toms. The cardioid pattern, again, is super useful for ejecting things like hi-hat from your snare or from all the cymbals to your toms. Like you really want to get, when you're making up a drum kit, generally, for like a pop kind of big drum sound, you're getting as kind of tight and isolated as possible from each independent instrument on the drum kit. So 9 times out of 10, engineers are using cardioid microphones for all of those close spot mics, I'll call them. And often the overheads, again, cardioid, because you want a focused kind of sound of the drum kit and less of the room sound.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess we'll have more specific examples of that when we talk about actually miking the kit. But then, yeah, I mentioned there's supercardioid, there's hypercardioid. We don't have an image for hypercardioid, but as you can see here with the supercardioid, it's really just sort of a further iteration of what we just saw with the cardioid makeup. So, yeah, I guess here, what is the difference between the two? Admitting that it's minor, is there any instance where one would be much preferred over the other in studio?
Yeah, definitely. Like it's all about kind of focus. Like I always talk about this as almost like a camera lens, and a supercardioid is going to have more reach. It's going to look deeper into the space almost, and it's going to be narrower along the sides. And because of the nature of microphone technology, in order to create that kind of narrow focus, you end up having to open up the back of the microphone and letting a bit of sound in. Like what's mentioned here in this slide is the boom mic, and one of the benefits to this kind of picker pattern and a boom mic is that it gives you a sense of space. So when you're, using a boom on set, you kind of get the sound of the room as well as the dialogue. So it really sets the stage for the space that the characters are in. And dialogue editors really like this type of sound, the sound of a boom mic versus kind of like the lapel mic or the hidden mics that you might find on set.
Right. So like a shotgun microphone, if folks are familiar with that term, that would essentially be a supercardioid or hypercardioid pickup pattern. Is that right?
Yes, that's how I understand it, yeah.
Bingo. Okay, another one, I guess the figure eight might be obvious when you're looking at the pattern here, also called bidirectional. Yeah, I guess these are fewer and further between than the other models we're talking about. But yeah, tell us a bit about the figure of eight style microphone and any examples that, well, I guess we say here it's great for stereo recording situations, but maybe any applications that you've had a lot of success with this type of mic.
Yeah, so this isn't necessarily a stereo microphone, although like maybe you look at this pattern and you assume like one side's going to be pan left and one side's going to be pan right. That's not what we're getting at here with this diagram. What this is just saying that from the front of the microphone you're going to get sound response, and from the back of the microphone you're going to get response. But on the sides you've got rejection. So this is a common a common pickup pattern for ribbon microphones, which we mentioned there, which is a microphone that I use quite often on a large variety of instruments. So the figure eight pattern for me is useful because it does pick up a bit of room and it gives you that sense of space, and it also gives you the option of good rejection on the side. So people will often use them in tandem with a second microphone. And what they do is they have this figure eight pattern kind of on the left and right side. So on this graphic, you'll see there's like the 90-degree point or the 70-degree point. Let's say the acoustic guitar is at that 270-degree or that 90-degree position. And then you have another microphone that is pointed directly at the acoustic, either at that 90 or 270-degree position. That's a cardioid pattern. And then you can process those two signals for a stereo result that gives you kind of this left-right image on the figure eight, as well as this kind of pointed center channel with the cardioid that's at the 270 or the 90. That's a little convoluted way of describing it, but it's basically a microphone pickup pattern for giving a sense of space and also providing the option of rejection on the two sides.
Right. Okay.
And another way that people use this microphone is that they'll put two vocalists, one on either side. That's if you're doing background vocals or something like that, this is a great solution for doing two vocalists at once.
Bingo. I jumped the gun a bit there, but yeah, our last example here, omnidirectional. The name says a lot, but essentially the point is in the center and it will pick up sound equally from anywhere within its sonic sphere. Yeah, I mean, we talk about it here, great for ambient or room mics, being able to pick up both the source and any reflections very naturally, gang vocals or group or choral vocals. Yeah, what are some examples of this? And again, maybe some examples of applications where this particular microphone has come in very handy in your work.
Yeah, so for me personally, I generally, if I'm doing a drum session, I have an omnidirectional microphone that we call the trash mic, and we put it kind of either really far away from the drum kit or just maybe 3 feet in front of a drum kit, and then we compress it on the way into our computer, and that gives this kind of raunchy, really aggressive, really forward sound, and we just kind of creep that in under the drums, and it adds this really exciting kind of rock feeling that's kind of ubiquitous when it comes to drum sounds, is this kind of crushed, distant thing that just kind of settles under. So when the cymbals all decay, you hear this nice kind of breathing of the room and the space, and it really just kind of paints the picture of like a band in a room. Yeah, like percussion, like often I'll put up an Omni mic kind of 3 feet away from myself, and if I'm doing the percussion and I'm also running the session, I just kind of sit at my workstation and do the percussion. I don't have to get up and turn towards the mic because the mic's kind of just picking up everything, and if you've got a nice sounding room, there's not a lot that you have to do in terms of treatment, or you might not need to process as much reverb or put that kind of short room that you might put on your shakers or your tambourines. If you've just got this omnidirectional mic kind of a few feet away from you and your room sounds nice. or like claps. If I'm doing group claps where maybe there's a group of people standing around one microphone, I definitely use the omnidirectional and get people to stand close or far depending on how many people there are or who's the best clapper, who's best in time, that kind of stuff. And another benefit to this pickup pattern is that it kind of emulates what your ears are like. So it is known to have like a flat or true sound. So it's always kind of like a true kind of picture of what your ears see or hear rather. Just getting back to that idea of the microphone as a lens, like this would be the closest thing to what your ears kind of pick up just in a room.
Mm-hmm. So then fair to say, like you mentioned that an omnidirectional, especially if your room is treated and good sounding, that it's a very useful tool. Since we're talking home recording, and typically, if there's one instrument that you're not going to do in your bedroom or basement, it's very often the drums. So does that mean like the omnidirectional may not be your best choice if you're in a, say, less than ideal acoustic environment?
I would say that's a adequate assessment. Yeah. Often you can get microphones that have swappable capsules. So I've got a couple of Avant-tone microphones, and they have just these little twist-off tops, and you can put on all of the things that we went through here, all the little capsule types or pickup pattern types. You can just screw on a different top, and voila, you've got that. So there's good budget options, low budget options where you can swap the capsules, and then as your room gets treated over time, you can maybe experiment a bit more with these more open sounding microphones.
Right. I should toss in now like another great example of that where it's actually not a switchable capsule, but where you can just turn your dial. Blues Yeti Pro microphone. It's very, very inexpensive. It connects directly to your computer via USB, so very much designed for like the home recordist, for podcasters. We use one for the Canadian Musician Radio program, and yeah, you have the choice to switch from figure 8, cardioid, omnidirectional. There's 4 options on it, and it's a very useful tool, especially for some of the applications we'll be describing here. So yeah, we're talking about the different pickup patterns. Next, we're going to talk about the different types of microphones, which typically fall into these 3 categories: dynamic, condenser, and ribbon. And we'll have Adam kind of walk us through each. But this is where the slides get a bit dense, just to give you as much info as possible for when you're digesting this after the fact. And I'll say now too, we're going to walk through the different types of microphones. We'll open it up to questions after that. So whether you've got a question about anything we've spoken about thus far, or I mean really Adam is here for you. So if you've got any questions even beyond the scope of what we're talking about here, feel free to throw those at us now. We'll get to as many as we can at the halfway point. And then, like I say, more coming at the very end. This is a great opportunity, so fire away. But yeah, we'll begin with the dynamic microphone. The Shure SM57 and SM58 that we mentioned earlier are very common examples of this, but here, let's walk through it a bit. So yeah, a fixed magnet with the moving capsule is a very kind of basic way to explain that. Adam, if you wouldn't mind playing resident scientist, yeah, walk us through some of these different characteristics and different uses for dynamic microphones specifically.
Great. Yeah, maybe I'll just start by saying that like a microphone is a transducer, so it takes changes in air pressure and it translates that into voltage. So often you have a magnet involved because you can create voltage by moving a piece of metal across a magnet and then amping that up. So a dynamic microphone, it's that exact thing. There's a fixed magnet, and then as you talk into it, there's a plate that moves at different speeds depending on the frequency, and then that gets translated into voltage. That's a very way to put it. These microphones, dynamic microphones, are super great starter microphones. Like every studio in the world would have an SM57, as I've said, and those are great microphones for untreated rooms, great microphones for beginners on instruments. If you've got a pop filter, it's great to put on the human voice. You'll see videos of like Tom Petty. He used to sing into a SM57 as his lead vocal microphone throughout like the 70s and 80s, which is, I find is kind of interesting because you don't hear a lot of this popping and stuff, but he's just got a unique microphone technique, I think. One of the things to note about dynamic microphones is that the closer you get to them, they'll create more low end. So sometimes that's a good thing or sometimes it's a bad thing. It's just something you have to manage either with performance if the artist is really good at leaning into the microphone during those intimate moments where you want that low end and then backing off when they're being loud and you just don't need that sub content. Or if you want to get more boom out of your acoustic guitar, you're just going to pull that thing a little closer, or if it needs to be a little thinner, you're going to pull it back and turn up the gain on your preamp to adjust that. One of the microphones we see pictured here, it's the SM7. So there's three very popular microphones from Shure that everybody kind of in the industry generally uses or knows about. The SM7 is that top one. It requires a lot of gain in order to work effectively. So you need a nice preamp for that microphone, or even one of those R2 pre's. That's something you can basically turn up. It might get a little noisy, but it's often worth it. That's a common microphone for radio voiceovers, or sorry, just radio voice. And it's the microphone I'm speaking into right now, although mine is heavily treated, so it might not be true to the sound of that microphone flat or just without an EQ on it. Yeah, like I say in the notes here, it's focused with good rear rejection, which again is good for a room that doesn't have a lot of acoustic treatment. One of these is just a great thing to have at home. I would say an SM57 should be everybody's first microphone. That's not always the case, but and it wasn't the case with me, but I would say that it would have been nice if I had done that. These are the mics you see at lots of bars when you go to play a bar. The sound guy might have a handful of SM57s and SM58s for all the voices. Sennheiser has a great line of dynamic microphones, the E-series, that are pretty ubiquitous as well. There's like the 900s are their kind of premium dynamic ones, and then you've got 800s and 600s, all of which are totally great and totally reliable and can be used for recording just as well as in the live environments. Yeah, what can I say? They'll take a lot of volume, so that's why you see these types of microphones used on snare drums and kick drums. There's like a specific kind of kick drum, couple of kick drums that we'll mention later. They're dynamic mics, you know, that's got that rigid magnet and a little plate and just moves across that and it creates voltage that gets translated to sound.
Beauty. Yeah, condenser mics. Everything is pretty much here. So I guess we can start like whereas the dynamic has the fixed magnet and the one that moves and conducts, or sorry, turns into voltage. What's the difference between that and the condenser? And then I guess I'll just leave it to you to walk us through some of these various characteristics.
Great. Yeah, so condenser mics, instead of having a magnet on one side, it's just two plates, and then between the plates is voltage. And as the voltage, as the plates move, there's one fixed plate and one that's floating. As that second plate moves into the fixed plate, it creates a different voltage in between the plates that gets calculated, and the preamp will juice it up. They're a little more sensitive. Like if you drop a condenser mic, the capsule might fall out or might break off and become disconnected. So they're a little more delicate than a condenser mic. So you'll often see them on shock mounts to reduce, that's actually for reducing low-end transmission to the microphone, because this technology is a little more sensitive. One of the things about condenser mics is that you'll notice right away if you put up like a dynamic mic and a condenser mic and compare them, the condenser mic will sound, I'd describe it as being more detailed. It'll also pick up more of the room. They're often wider in their pickup patterns, meaning they're more sensitive to like noise. So if you live in a noisy apartment building or if you're next to a window where there's a lot of traffic and you're trying to record vocals, a condenser mic may not be your best option if you've got a noisy environment. I think that's one of the reasons why we say here that it's well suited for a treated environment. It's because you're going to get more of that room sound in the microphone. They'll have typically a louder output than a dynamic microphone, so you might be able to get away with a preamp that is a little less costly or a little more noisy, and you won't have to push it as hard. These microphones require 48 volts of electricity, so you want to make sure you have a preamp or a mixer that can spit out that 48 volts because they basically will not sound without that. And some of the microphones will have like little battery slot and you can put a battery in it. Like boom mics we mentioned earlier, those are all generally condenser microphones and either run from a battery or like a portable system that can pump out that 48 volts, and that 48 volts is what goes between those plates, and then they create the difference in voltage. Yeah, it says here that they're available in tube and solid. I don't know if solid state's really the right word. It is, yeah, it's a transistor that's in the microphone, and then often you'll get these tube condenser microphones that can get really pricey, and really nice and high end. You can kind of pay whatever you want for a condenser mic, and all the way from down from like $80 to $80,000, whatever you want. They're kind of the most ubiquitous for the studio environment. For vocals, you'll see people singing into like Neumann U87s would be kind of maybe the most ubiquitous, classiest condenser microphone that's out there. They get used as drum overheads a lot of time. Room mics on drums, acoustic guitars, very, very common for people to use condenser mics on acoustic guitars in like an XY pattern or in a stereo pattern. I use them in the studio all the time for acoustic guitars. Generally, sometimes I'm using a 57. I mentioned that a little later. On acoustic guitars, drum overheads, 99% of the time I'm using that 8kg you see in the top there, that 452 I think it is. I don't know right off the top of my head. Basically, yeah, every studio's got a pile of these, and if it were me at home and I was just starting out, I definitely want one of those SM57s, and I also want one of a condenser of some kind, either a large one like we see here, this Sennheiser in the bottom right, or a small one that's that 8kg we see up there. So you have your large diaphragm condenser and the small diaphragm condenser, and generally the large diaphragm condenser has a better low-end response, but that's not always the case. It just depends on the microphone style.
We've got some great questions here that I appreciate, and I could jump into right now, but we've only got the one more kind of microphone to discuss. So we'll get this into the mix and then throw to some of these cues. Ribbon mics. The Royer 121, which I guess I can plug, Adam was kind enough to review for us in Canadian Musician and Professional Sound a while ago, and has since become a staple at the Hill Sound Studio. So yeah, ribbon microphone, a very unique and cool model here. Rode just came out with a new one a couple of years ago. Yeah, walk us through the characteristics of this one, if you please, and then yeah, we'll jump to some questions and move on to our next half.
Totally, yeah, thanks. So actually what we have pictured here is the Royer 122, which is a ribbon microphone that's kind of a beefed up version of the classic Royer 121. These are, yeah, like a kind of a dark sounding microphone, and they have a really fast attack, which means they're really great for drum rooms, meaning that first punch of those drums hits this microphone really well and kind of fast, and then when you comes out the speakers, when that gets translated into a playback environment, it's just the snares and all those kinds of transients poke out and really sound live and present, and can give your music a lot of great depth. This isn't a microphone that people generally use on vocals. It's more of an instrument microphone, and in 99% of the time these ribbon microphones are figure-8 patterns, just because of the nature of the technology. It's probably 100% of the time. I don't really know off the top of my head, but basically you have a little thin corrugated piece of aluminum sitting between two magnets, which you can actually see the magnets on the microphone. They're those kind of wings on the outside of that top part. Basically these microphones, I just love the way these sound. They're dark, so if you've got an instrument that sounds like brittle or bright, you put this thing on it, it just sounds rich. And yeah, vibey is a great word that you have in there. That's just a perfect description of what this mic is. Yeah, and it says uses there: mono drum rooms, strings. It sounds so great on violin. I love it. And guitar amps. A lot of people use these for guitar amps in the studio alongside a 57, or they use these for guitar amps live settings, which to me is kind of surprising, but it's a really common live mic as well. It's just got a great low-end response, really fast attack, and it does require a lot of gain. The 121 and most ribbon microphones do not require phantom power. It can be broken if you give them phantom power because that aluminum filament is so delicate. Yeah, it's just a really fun microphone for me to use and to have discovered through getting that review.
Awesome. So I said we'd jump to questions, but I guess we can round it out here with some accessories, one of which you see in the image here. But yeah, why don't we walk through these really quickly, and then we'll jump to some of these questions.
Yeah, great. These are pretty simple. You got a pop filter there. I'm sure everyone has seen what that is and understands that's just used to prevent big popping sounds which come out for consonants that have a lot of air that push across them, like P's or B's or sometimes T's. Maybe it's happening to my microphone right now. I have removed the pop filter. The shock mount is used to reduce low-end transmission to the microphone. So condenser microphones, often the capsule is really sensitive to handling noise, they call it, where if you touch the mic and shake it, it's going to get all this low-end rumble. That's why you have these mounts with rubber bands that kind of suspend it, is to prevent other instruments that might be transmitting through the floor up the mic stand and into the mic, creating that low-end kind of rumble. So if you're like playing the acoustic guitar and you're stomping your foot on the floor, a shock mount will help prevent low-end kind of blurriness that could result from that. A reflection filter, if you've seen those, are really cool. It's just like this rounded foam thing on a stand, for lack of a better description, that helps reduce the room sound reaching into the mic. SE makes a great line of reflection filters worth looking into. If you don't want to treat your whole room, you can just create this little kind of, tent's not the right word, but just a kind of a foam baffle on a stand that you sing into, that your mic sits into. An XY mount is just a mount in which you can place two small diaphragm condensers or two microphones of any kind in an XY configuration, which we'll talk about in a sec, and it just makes that setup a little easier where you don't need two stands, you just need one stand and this little mount. And a dual mic mount is the same thing. It's just basically a mount that holds two microphones on a stand as opposed to two stands holding two microphones.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to be totally clear, and it may very well be obvious, but the shock mount, as you can see in the photo, is how the stand is sort of isolated from the mic with that series of elastic cordage there. It reminds you very much of like in high school science class when you had to come up with a device to drop an egg off the roof, and anyone who didn't break would get the grade. Very much related to this concept here. Yeah, great for vocals. So, okay, some great questions here. Feel free to continue to throw them at us as we're talking. And as I mentioned, if we don't get to yours now, we will by the end of the session here. But let's get rolling. The very first one that came in, actually it's a bit tough. Maybe we'll start here. A really good question here, an interesting one. Adam, what's more important if you're trying to get started with home recording, maybe have an untreated space like a room in your house? Is it a better idea to invest a lot of money in a great microphone and use it in the untreated environment, or would you recommend a much cheaper alternative for the microphone but putting some money into treating the room?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I personally would say that you should meet in the middle on both of those investments, let's say. Yeah, I would definitely buy like that SM57 and put paneling up in my room, or build a simple baffle that I could maybe move around versus putting all my eggs in one basket and getting a really nice microphone. Often a really expensive microphone is a condenser. It's really open sounding and it's getting a lot of that room sound, so you're not doing yourselves any favors by putting that classic microphone, which is generally designed for a studio environment, in a really like gnarly sounding room that might be like boingy or reflective sounding, and it really, that can take away from some of the intimacy. So my suggestion would be, yeah, like go mid-grade for both of those things, and you'll have a way better footing.
Awesome. Yeah, when we were talking about the SM58 and some mics for vocal use, and we will, I guess we are kind of jumping the gun with this, but again, a good question. We appreciate the engagement. Someone had asked about like an ideal microphone for capturing the female voice. I know in a lot of cases, a good model will do just as well for each, but yeah, have you ever mixed up your choice based on having a higher vocal range?
Ooh, yeah, great question. Every microphone's different. Every vocalist is different. I wouldn't say that it's based on gender ever or pitch ever. It's more tone and timbre that makes my decision in terms of selecting microphones. So if the person has a nasal tone, I might choose a darker mic. Like maybe if they were very nasal, maybe I'd try that Royer ribbon to see if it really tamed down that 1 to 3K area that some people have an issue with. Or maybe I'm going to use that SM7 if people have a really bright voice and I want that warmth and I want that intimacy. I'm going to use a dynamic mic. Whereas if someone has a really bassy voice and I want to get some top end clarity, I might try a condenser. I might try a small diaphragm condenser. But it's, like I said, it's not based on pitch generally. It's based on tone and timbre.
There you go. Yeah. Okay. So the question that started off, and it is a great one. I just thought we'd lob some easier ones at you. Yeah, someone's asking about phasing when it comes to different mic techniques, and I guess we are going to get to this. So, Adam, if you want to defer until after we've spoken about, some of the ways for miking up a guitar cab, or maybe better yet, a snare drum, for example, that are very dependent on phase. Or actually, maybe we can just introduce exactly what phasing means and some just general rules to make sure that you're in an optimal position to avoid that.
Absolutely. So you've got absolute phase, which is it basically means what direction is your polarity. So we talked about voltage. You have positive or negative voltage. So you've got a frequency. It's oscillating from positive to negative, and if the absolute phase, meaning it's starting positive, is what you want. When you zoom in on your waveform in your DAW, you see that kick drum transient, or you see that guitar hit, or you see that P from your pop of a word. You want to see that all of those transients are starting in a positive manner, meaning that waveform starts by going up and then comes down. And the way that translates to a speaker is that the speaker is going to be pushing out when that digital information gets translated back into sound pressure waves through the speaker, so that the speakers are doing the right thing. When that kick drum hits and that transient pushes, the speaker's pushing out. So that's your absolute phase, meaning the polarity of the microphone. And then when you talk about phasing, it's generally people are talking about either two microphone sources being in phase with one another. Meaning what can happen is two sources can get picked up, and if the phase isn't aligned beautifully or in a nice way, you'll start to find that some frequencies get subtracted and other frequencies get boosted, and you end up with an unbalanced sound. Or another issue would be if your heads, things that were mic'd up in phase, and you just swapped the phase on one of them, one speaker would be pushing the sound and the other speaker would be pulling the sound, and that creates a strange auditory kind of psychoacoustic illusion where your brain is just like, what's going on here? It's a little hard to describe, and it's not something I describe very often or very well, but yeah, we'll talk a bit more. Like you say, the snare drum's a great example for multiple microphones phasing with one another. Basically, you're only going to run into it as an issue if you're using two microphones at one sound source. And there's something called the 3-to-1 rule, where the distance between the two microphones and the distance between the sound source should always be either the same or 3 times greater, meaning the distance between the sound source and the two microphones is 3 times greater. So the 3-to-1 rule would be something to look up there if I've just confused everybody.
Well, I was just gonna step in the explain this to me like I'm 5 because I'm the person that needed this explained to them like they're 5. But yeah, when you consider every sound is basically just a wave that goes up and down and equally dynamic, something being totally out of phase would be when it's the exact same sound source and when one pickup device is getting that wave at its very top, the other is getting it at its very bottom. It's basically how noise canceling headphones work. Like if you're on an airplane and want your noise canceling headphones, there's an active microphone that's picking up everything outside of your microphone or outside of your headphones, sorry, and then basically reproducing those exact sounds 180 degrees out of phase into your headphones, which is what lets you listen to your Joni Mitchell record and completely avoid the screaming kid next to you. It is a tough thing to talk about, so if you throw in and out of phase into Google, you probably get a very good graphic visual example of that. But thank you, Adam, for what was a very good try there. I'm sorry, not a try because you were successful, just if anyone wants more
Oh
information.
no, it was a try.
Let's move on here. Yeah, a couple more questions. These ones should have pretty quick answers, and we'll jump back into this. Someone's just asking for a clarification when we talk about tube versus solid-state microphones or tube versus non-tube microphones. What's the difference?
One of them has so the tube microphone has a little vacuum tube built into it. I'm not sure exactly the science behind what that job of that tube is. I believe it's involved with the amplification of the voltage. I think that's what it is. So one has a little vacuum tube. You may have seen them in tube amps or like at home theater systems or home stereo systems rather, or in guitar amps, those little glowing tubes in the back. So you can have microphones that have those tubes built right into them, or there's a power supply that's a separate block that the tube is sitting in. Whereas most microphones, like all the dynamic ones that we mentioned, or some of the ribbon ones, there's a what's the word I'm looking for? Not a transducer, basically a
That's
coil
funny.
of metal instead of this tube. And the
Um,
characteristics being different would be like a tube microphone would be just a little warmer sounding, a little richer sounding, a little more vintage sounding, a little darker, and they're a little less easy to reproduce because every tube is a little different and tubes will wear out differently over time. So if you're looking for something that's kind of more reliably clean, you're going to go with a non-tube mic or a solid state mic.
Right on. Shout out to Jackie here because I really want to hear her sing now. It sounds like she was asking more in a live environment, although maybe there's a solution that would fit both live and studio. But she is a rich voiced, so let me get the wording here. Uh-oh, I just removed it. A rich voiced singer with a large range that sings in both rock and jazz. So yeah, I'm just thinking a very big, dynamic voice, a lot of octaves. Can you recommend something she should even just give a try as far as singing and yeah, favorably picking up her voice?
Ooh, that's a great question. I always would suggest every vocalist become extremely familiar with the SM58 because it's kind of the king of vocal microphones, especially in a live setting. And if you want something with a bit more dynamic range and a bit lower noise floor and something that's maybe a little more fun to sing into, you're going to look at maybe the Beta 58 line. It sure has kind of more of a higher end version of that microphone that a lot of vocalists seems to really love. And there's also Neumann microphones has a great dynamic microphone. I don't know the model number right off the bat, but they make like a kind of a SM58 equivalent that's again got a really large dynamic range, can handle a lot of sound pressure, and has extended low frequency.
Uh, Great question just came in from Madeline. We will save that because we're actually going to talk about miking up horns in a minute. But if we don't touch on this, I'll put that in front of Adam. Laura, your question coming up as well. But let's roll on here. And I see we're creeping up on the hour here. So not that we want to rush through it, but as I mentioned, there's a lot of info in the slideshow itself. So you can just have Adam kind of scan through it and add any tidbits that are unique to the or his experience, I should say. But I guess we talked about this earlier, like when you're building your collection, and Adam, I hope you don't mind, after I walk through this, feel free to add anything. He stated several times, Shure SM, there's a typo, SM57, which you see in the bottom right corner there, is a great all-purpose instrument microphone. It has been used on voice on some very famous recordings in the past, so a very versatile, I was going to say dynamic, but maybe that's not the best term to use just because it could be confusing. But a very versatile, all-purpose microphone. Some other staples here, and we've got them like for vocals. We've mentioned the SM58, arguably the universal standard when you think of a live or a microphone in general. That very well might be what pops in mind. SM7, we'll have a photo of that shortly. NT1A, a great example of a relatively inexpensive large diaphragm microphone. Same with the 4040 from Audio-Technica. Instruments, I mean, it's all here for you, and we'll talk about some of these specific examples coming up in a second. And as Adam alluded to earlier, the designated kick drum microphone, you see we've got a picture of Adam's Shure Beta 52 in the top right there. The AKG D112 looks very similar to that. Again, like a very big kind of stubby microphone that I guess sort of physically suits what you think of it being used for with a kick drum or a really punchy low-end source. You want to add anything in there before we jump to some of these common mic configurations?
No, you've covered it all. Thanks, Andrew.
Well, it's all your information. I just thought I'd mouth through it to speak quickly, and because I Yeah, common configurations though. So we've alluded to X, Y, and stereo pair already, but just quickly walk through these, Adam, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, so we've got a microphone technique. That just means basically one mic pointed anywhere at what you're looking to pick up. XY stereo means you've got two microphones really close together with they're almost sitting on top of one another, crossed at 90 degrees or 120 degrees, depending on how wide you want them to sound. If you got a stereo pair, it just means two microphones pointed at one source. This is one that you definitely want to do that 3-to-1 rule that we mentioned earlier. It's worth looking up. A Bloomian pair is typically two figure-8 mics in XY pattern. That's a really unique thing that I personally have never done before, but I'll see that done for huge orchestral projects. They'll have these Bloomian pairs sitting around the room, and mid-side was the one I described earlier, where you have one figure-8 and one cardioid working in stereo, and it creates this kind of three-point image where you've got one of the figure-8 sides on your left speaker, one of the figure-8 sides on your right speaker, and then this cardioid imager on the center channel. And it's a pretty unique thing that we've done a couple times for like a drum room mic, or if you were doing like a group of stringed instruments, it would give a good real life representation.
I'm interested in that Bloomian pair because when I picture the two figure-8s in XY pattern, it almost seems like an omnidirectional, except you've got the ability to manipulate or more closely manipulate those two different pickups. Is that accurate? Like, is that a common use for this?
I feel like it's used kind of to simulate an omnidirectional microphone, but when you only have two figure-8 patterns at hand. It's kind of something that people kind of they don't really tweak it too much. You kind of set it up and let all of the microphones do their job. It's not something you're often tweaking. I don't know if that answers your question. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it just seems like an interesting concept and you picture what those patterns would look like. But alas, so yeah, talking now about some very basic kind of general tips of if you're looking to mic some common sound sources. We're going to talk about vocals, acoustic and electric guitar. We'll talk about drums, and then we'll get to horns and strings as well. So yeah, we're coming at you, Laura. Or sorry, Madison was the one that asked about the horns, which is a great question. We're going to get to it in a sec. But yeah, lead vocals. I mean, we talked about the pop filter in front of the microphone, shock mount underneath it, which both great ideas for this application. Yeah, I guess, you know, if you're going for that very basic no frills vocal track, Adam, walk us through some of these other general pointers, if you please.
Yeah, so traditionally in pop music, your voice is front center stage, and in order to get that kind of detail and intimacy, regardless of how big and loud the vocalist is, you just get the microphone, me personally, right up there. If I'm using the dynamic mic, the person's lips are almost touching that microphone, or they're touching the pop filter that's right in front of it. I use a little vocal kind of booth, these two walls of kind of sound treated baffles, so that there's no distraction from the room, and there's no distraction from like my mouse clicking or traffic outside. It's a very quiet environment. Basically, you just want to get right in there. Make sure you're not clipping, obviously, on your preamp. You want to make sure your settings are nice there, and that you're leaving headroom for those louder sections. Don't be afraid to record quiet if you're expecting a loud section to come in. If the singer is quite dynamic, basically set up 2 or 3 mics, or however many mics you have. Do a test and then decide which is best for that vocalist. I would say that's one of the best things to do, is just do a shout out, they call it, or a shootout, something people call it.
Shout out, that actually makes a lot of sense in this application. Yeah, so we've got the lead vocals. Now, as far as like chorus or background vocals, shouts out to my hardcore fans out there. It's a staple of it. But yeah, you're after something a little different here, kind of not wanting to compete in that same space. So what are some examples you use for that? Or I guess, would this also apply to things like hand claps and you know, kind of those group, whole room type tracks?
Yeah, definitely. For me, when I'm miking up background vocals, I'm thinking about, yeah, clearing space for the lead vocalist. So I'm often asking vocalists to take a step back from the microphone if they're doing backgrounds, or I'm swapping out to a different microphone, either an omnidirectional If there's 2 or 3 people, or even if I feel like then omnidirectional is going to represent the person well, or the room sounding good to me that day, or it's quiet outside, I'll do that. But I generally try not to stack too much of the same microphone or the same distance to the microphone on top of itself, because then you kind of start getting this clouded effect where the lead vocal gets a little eaten up. Even if you just take 3 steps back for your background vocals, if if they're not too quiet or whispery, if there is a bit of power behind them, you're going to notice that they sit in the mix a lot better, and that the lead vocal retains its position, and those background vocals have a bit of space to play around with.
Bingo. Electric guitar, amp, or cab. Again, there's a lot of different ways to do this. Some very creative and crafty and elaborate things people have come up with, but we're talking about, some staples, some industry standards here. So yeah, the electric guitar, amp, or cab if you're not using the combo. But the image pretty much says it all here. Walk us through this. I mean, we mentioned the SM57 ribbon mic specifically, which is what's in the image. But what's the advantage of those 2 different types of mics? Tell us a bit about placements and maybe any variations of this that might produce some interesting results.
Great, yeah. So this is a real classic one. You've got the Royer ribbon and the SM57 in the image. The Royer offers this extended low end and a really fast attack, while the 57 has this punchy mid sound that is very detailed, and it's just a really ubiquitous kind of guitar sound. Often you'll see, instead of the Royer ribbon, you'll see a Sennheiser MD421, and sometimes people just tape that right onto the 57, or the 57 gets taped to the Sennheiser MD421. This is an example of a situation where you want to make sure the capsules are lined up in distance to the speaker, because you will get that phase cancellation that we mentioned earlier, where the sound's going to hit one microphone a little later than the other, and then you're going to get a little muddy where frequencies get canceled out. So this is one where you want to pay close attention. You record both of these microphones, and then what I do is swap the phase on one of them, and if the sound almost disappears, I know that my phase is good and that the sound is hitting both of those capsules at the exact millisecond. If I'm still hearing it when I'm swapping the phase on one of them, I just move one of the microphones back or forward until it basically cancels out. Then I lift my phase reverse switch and record it, and then go to town and blend the microphones as they sound good.
Bingo. Acoustic guitar. We're void of an image here, but I think the description says a lot of it. Adam had me record a song that was very simple acoustic vocals, and this was my first experience with this. Yeah, again, if you don't mind, walk us through your basic configuration as laid out here, and again, maybe any variations on that. And my last point here, I've got SM57 with aggressive EQ, question mark, because that is something that Adam had proposed. It's, I guess, a bit unique.
Yeah, I think a lot of people just kind of go for a small diaphragm condenser when they're recording acoustic guitar, or a large diaphragm condenser, because it's detailed and it picks up a lot of the intricacies in an acoustic guitar. Sometimes what I'll do is just use an SM57, and you get kind of this meatier, darker, grittier acoustic guitar sound. So if somebody's not a really strong acoustic guitar player, then this might be a great microphone choice, because some of those squeaks and clicks and all those kinds of just general artifacts from the actual instrument itself are a little clouded by the lack of pure detail in that microphone. I generally point any microphone, if it's an SM57 or a condenser, I put it right at the 12th fret, and then I try backing it off, and I try pointing it at the hole a bit more, but I generally start at that position where the body of the guitar meets the neck. 9 times out of 10, that's where I find it sounds the best. And 9 times out of 10, I'm actually using a mono microphone. I don't do stereo microphones a lot these days, unless it's for a song in which I know I'm not going to layer too much on. So if it was just a voice and an acoustic guitar, yeah, I might throw up 2 mics in an XY position. But if it's a full production and I know that acoustic job has a small job in the production of the orchestration, I'm probably going to go with a single microphone on it.
Bingo. And then I think your description when we were talking was, call me crazy, but I've been using an SM57. Yeah, what makes that a unique choice? And when you mention the aggressive EQ, what's the purpose of that?
Yeah, it can be like a thuddy sounding microphone with a lot of information around 300 hertz. So I just suck out a lot of 300 hertz, and I crank a lot of 5K or 8K depending on the guitar and the performer. I just want that high end that condenser mic will generally bring to the table that the 57 might not have. And again, that's probably due a bit to, in part, to the proximity effect in that the mic is close to the guitar and things are a little boomy at times, so I just scoop that stuff right out with an EQ.
Bingo. This is a big one to pack into one slide, and the images here, I guess your two maybe most in typical rock music at least, key parts of the drum kit, your kick drum, your snare. We've got those images here, and Adam will walk us through those. But when it comes to drums, this is really a unique animal, something that a lot of people will do home recording themselves, and guitar, voice, those are easy to track in, say, a less than ideal acoustic environment. Drums being a different animal. Let's talk about it.
Great, yeah. So we see a picture of a kick drum and a snare drum. The kick drum in our case in this image has no hole cut into it, which might be unique for some people. I think a lot of people kind of just have that hole. I would put the microphone, if it had a hole, put that microphone right where that hole is, where there's a lot of air moving, because you're going to get a good representation of all the low end. You're also going to get a great attack from a skin that has a hole into it. I generally like to record without that hole because there's a lot of low end that comes off the drum, but I also always use that kick drum microphone channel to trigger another kick drum sample when I'm mixing. That gives me that point in that attack. So when I'm miking drums, I spot mic everything, close mics on kick, close mics on snare. We'll put a snare bottom on there. So we see in this picture, we just see the top, or you can kind of see it there. There's a bottom mic, and the bottom mic gets the phase reversed on it because they're pointing at each other pretty much, those microphones. So you want to make sure that it's hitting both of those microphones at the same time. Microphones, yeah, close mic on the hi-hat, close mic on the toms. I'd use two overheads. I use two room mics. That trash mic we talked about, that mono room mic on the drums, that's a real big important one for me. So the center channel of the drums has this reality. It's kind of crushed up, junky feeling. It's kind of a classic drum sound, I'd say. Sometimes we set up two sets of room mics. Really, people kind of go over the top with drum miking traditionally in the studio environment, and then they pare it down in the mix, or you use a little bit of everything. One of the things I mentioned here, which is great for home recordists or people who don't have a big microphone collection, rather, is the Glyn Johns microphone setup. That's something that if you want to record drums at home, you should totally look into. And I've had really great success, and I've worked with producers who insist on using this. And it's basically just three microphones. You've got a kick drum microphone and two overheads that have this kind of strange setup where one's over the floor tom almost, and one's over the top of the drum kit pointed right at the snare. So you don't have these tight spot mics on the toms, but this would be one that you'd hear on like Led Zeppelin recordings where they were limited to track counts back in the day. It's really worth looking into. A lot of people use condenser mics when they're miking up the overheads and the hi-hat mics, but a lot of dynamic mics get used on those close spot mics for the snares and toms and kicks.
If it's good enough for Bonzo, it's good enough for you. Strings and horns we'll walk through. And yeah, these are both ones, I guess, that maybe are less common, which also I think means there's a lot more variation on how different engineers will capture these instruments, but Adam's got some experience with both, so strings first, horns coming right on the back of it. Give us a quick tip.
Great, yeah, so strings are tricky to record because they can be harsh and brittle sounding. That's why I choose ribbons. A lot of times I used to use condensers, and I was struggling to get a good sound that would sit in the mix and represent all the rich harmonic content that the strings had in the room. And as soon as I started using a ribbon mic, I was like, oh, that's how you record strings. So there are budget ribbons out there if you can't afford the Royer. There's Rode, like you mentioned earlier. They just came out with one that's probably reasonably priced, and there's Art. I think they have a series of ribbon mics. If you can try out a ribbon, go and rent one and see how it works if you're a person who has strings at home, and compare it to your other microphones. I think you'll be surprised.
Easy. And then horns, Madison, this one's for you. She'd mentioned having heard that ribbon mics work really well on horns, but also that there's a risk for that, which, well, we've got all capped here as though it was premonition, but tell us about your approach for capturing horns.
Very much the same as strings, whereas like I was having trouble capturing horns. They're super loud, so you need a mic that can handle that. They can feel harsh because because of the nature of microphones, are pointed right at the hole, which is kind of what I generally do. These days I've been backing off a bit of foot, and I've been using a ribbon microphone because it's got that extended low end and that fast attack. Again, if you can just try renting, if you've struggled recording horns at home, just rent a ribbon microphone, test it out, and you'll be like, oh, there it is. This works really easily.
Yeah, but you mentioned it earlier too, like with that very, very thin aluminum filament, you can't throw too much volume into a ribbon mic, which I think is why you mentioned it's surprising that some people use them on a cab, which, you know, I guess is fine in the studio, but live might be cringeworthy. But yeah, just be careful with your investment. Awesome. I'm very excited. I'm glad we got through that in great time. Few more questions here. So yeah, Madeline, hopefully that answers yours. Or I guess she'd asked about, you know, anything else she needs to know when handling a ribbon mic, or maybe just any properties as far as being a responsible mic owner. Any tips?
Yeah, treat it like a little baby. Don't drop it. One of the things is, don't like breathe too hard across it. Like, don't intentionally let it catch a bunch of wind, because it could tear the ribbon. The ribbon's only going to last so long, so it will at some point it'll start to change in the way it sounds, and then who knows how many years you might need to get re-ribboned. Or if it was a low-end kind of mic, maybe you can send it back to the factory, and they have some kind of system in place where you can pay to have them ribboned. I'm not sure. I haven't dealt with that yet myself, just because I'm still a relatively new ribbon mic owner. And yeah, one of the benefits to the ribbon mic that we have here, the 122, is that it has a pad, which is a volume reduction. So it's designed to be hit with a lot of volume, and you just hit the switch and it protects itself basically. One way to prevent it from being too hurt is just back it off or point it slightly away. One thing about ribbon microphones is that if you just point them slightly away, it doesn't change the character of the sound as much as other types of microphones would. So you just don't sing right into it, or don't play the horn right into it. Just turn the microphone, 30 degrees off axis and play into that, and you'll probably extend its life a bit.
Bingo. We got through a lot of questions at the first half. If anyone has anything else, even if it's a little off topic, we might as well get it out now, because there's only one more here. And yeah, is there a microphone that's ideal for YouTube uploads? What I would say there, and obviously a very well recorded track, if you upload it to YouTube, it'll carry enough information that you can tell the difference between that and a crappy one. But if you're looking for, like, I'm assuming maybe just to upload some demos or some covers to YouTube sort of on the fly, a couple we mentioned, like Rhodes NT USB, for example, like a very inexpensive, large diaphragm mic that has a USB connection, go direct into your computer. It's very, very, very low noise, and yeah, I think it would do the job for inexpensive for what you want to do it for. I also mentioned Blues Yeti Pro, which is a great one, just being able to switch from the different pickup patterns. It's also large diaphragm, direct USB, comes with a hefty stand, and it also looks very cool. So yeah, not that you can't, there's nothing hurting you from going big if you're uploading it to YouTube, but even just having a designated mic, as inexpensive as it might be, you're already leaps and bounds ahead of what gets posted there a lot. So I will leave it to Adam. Maybe he's got some stories of something good and inexpensive that's ideal for that. But those two models I mentioned are great examples. And if you throw that again into Google and maybe crowdsource some reviews, you'll probably come up with some great options there as well.
Yeah, totally. Those are two great options. Sennheiser makes a digital microphone, the MK4 digital, I believe. That's another good option. One thing to note about YouTube is that all of the volume of everything on YouTube is normalized to some degree, meaning that YouTube turns up or down the volume on the content that you submit, so that when people are listening to YouTube, they don't have to reach for their volume knob all the time. So one way to prevent your music from sounding too crappy on YouTube, which can happen quite easily, is don't record it too hot, or don't put your output super, super loud, because YouTube will take care of making it as loud as it wants to be for their listeners. And if you hit it too hot, it's not going to sound as good as if you hit it just under where they want you to hit it.
Bingo. Yeah, that brings us to the end here. Thank you very, very much for joining us. More than appreciated. I mentioned at the beginning, if you go to musicbooksplus.com/webinar, here are some kind of catch-all books that'll build on what we're talking about. If you are interested in sinking your teeth into home recording, some great titles here. There's many more at the site, as well as some tips for making the most of your webinar experience. Since you've registered, you'll get an email, I think 24 hours from now, sharing a link to this recording so you can access our whole session here at your leisure. Feel free to replay it and everything. There we go. Just stop so you can see the screen. And yeah, big thanks, Adam Gallant from the Hill Sound Studio in Charlottetown, PEI. Great little room, very experienced engineer, and you can't find a more beautiful part of the country. Again, that's where I am. That's how I know Adam. And so if you're looking for somewhere to cut some tracks, consider that. There's info at the website as well. You can get in touch with Adam. You can get in touch with us at NWC Webinars. Again, my name is Andrew King, editor of Canadian Musician. Adam Gallant, owner, operator, engineer, mixer, producer, many things at the Hill Sound Studio. Huge thank you for joining us. It was a privilege having you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks again to everyone. Please fill out the survey on your way out. It just helps us better cater these towards you. Yeah. Thank you very, very much.